Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Would some of you mind doing me a favor and just moving a little bit closer? It's very lonely up here, as I'm the only one in this session. But please do feel free to ask questions during this presentation. So my name is Trishar Barot. I've just started a relatively new role with a very weird title called Apps Editor for BBC World Service and our Global News Division. And in terms of what that role entails, part of it is to work on the next generation of our news apps for our various language services at BBC World Service. So we have 26 different language services that cover different parts of the world. But I guess the more significant part of the role, certainly at the moment, is looking at our editorial strategy around chat apps or instant messaging platforms, which is a very weird thing to actually put such a big bet and actually appoint someone to actually just focus just on this. And so what the presentation today is going to be about is just a little bit more background about what the BBC has been doing over the course of the past sort of 6 or 7 months or so, where we really just started paying a lot more attention to different types of chat platforms and trying to see if we could figure out what, if any, editorial propositions there could be around them, how they would work, and what the potential audience interest in them would be. So where did all of this first start? It actually goes back a little time, 3 years, to the London riots. At that time, I managed a team in the BBC called the UGC Social Media Hub, which is a sort of a centralized team in the BBC newsroom that handles a lot of user-generated content from our existing audiences from across online radio and TV. But they also do a lot of what I guess we would call social media news gatherings, so going out onto Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and so on to try and verify, authenticate, and then try and get content on air. Now, during the summer of 2011, when the London riots happened over a series of several days, the team was already very proficient, as I'm sure everyone is now, with trying to find content and eyewitnesses on the traditional social media platforms that we know of. But one thing that really took us aback and by surprise was the fact that a lot of the younger rioters, but also young people who were eyewitnesses on the streets in those evenings, were sharing a lot of their information and content on BlackBerry Messenger. And up until that point, we as a team had pretty much ignored BlackBerry Messenger because it was just a chat app, right? And what possible real editorial or news gathering use was that? Well, it turns out that it actually became one of the go-to platforms to really get interesting information and content in terms of pictures and video about what was going on in the streets of London. And as it happened, 2 or 3 of our team members had BlackBerry handsets at the time. Remember those? And one of the benefits of that was that they were starting to get some of these random messages on BlackBerry Messenger, which they seem to be being added to various sort of random groups inside BBM, and they started getting some of these sorts of messages of the type that you see on the screen here. And as it turned out, we used this sort of source of information to feed into our news desk raw intelligence about what we were getting, and that actually informed their decisions about where to deploy journalists and producers, and so it became a very significant sort of a tool for us. And ever since then, really, we've been just keeping an eye on how this technology is developing and emerging, and though whilst BlackBerry may have sort of taken a downward curve, the actual rise of the technology has been pretty unrelenting. And you will have seen and heard a lot of information about this over the past year. Just to give you one indication of just how rapid the growth has been with chat apps, just as one example with WhatsApp, it currently has 600 million active users, so already nearly triple the number of active users that Twitter has. But if you compare WhatsApp at the same 4-year growth cycle as Facebook, Gmail, or Skype, you can see it far outstrips them in terms of the rapid user growth of that platform. And so it was the middle of last year when we started seeing these numbers, and we started thinking about, is this more than just some sort of side sort of phenomenon, but this is something that we really need to pay attention to, because if there are that many people on this platform, then is there an opportunity for us to see if we can engage with them? Because it was a similar problem that we faced with BlackBerry Messenger 3 years ago, which was that this is a closed ecosystem. So unlike the more open sort of platforms of YouTube and Twitter and to an extent Facebook, chat apps are closed, and so you can't really get into them or get anything out of them, which is a real pain if you're a journalist. And the only way you can really begin to engage with the audiences or if you're inside the platform. So how do you figure out what that looks like and how you do it? So it was in January when I took on a project for a few months where the original idea was to just do a bit of research and put together a sort of a paper to put to various news managers at the BBC at the end of the 3-4 month period with some ideas or suggestions. But actually, we decided to be a little bit more bold and decide to just actually try out some of these platforms as sort of low-level pilots. And if any of you work in an organization which is a bit like the BBC, which is full of quite a lot of bureaucracy and committees and so on, the word pilot is a sort of a magic word, certainly that I found. And so our sort of editorial policy team, the legal teams and fair trading teams were relatively relaxed about us trying stuff out, because they knew that this was just a sort of a testing sort of exercise, and we weren't going to roll out sort of permanent services at this stage. So one of the key very initial things I discovered as part of my research in sort of January, February of this year was that the more I spoke to these companies, the more I understood how users operated, how they use these platforms. These weren't just free alternatives to text messaging. These were actually mobile-first social media platforms, and really just try and understand them in that context. I'll talk about some of these apps. There are many, many different chat apps out there that are strong in different parts of the world. And actually part of my work was to try and figure out which apps are strong in which regions and how we can potentially connect our pilots to regions of the world that are very strong, but also stories that we think are going to be very big in that region or that country for a period of time. And then thirdly, the resourcing is a big issue. My team was me. And so I had to make sure that I had access to journalists or producers from local teams who may already be covering these stories, and so rolling in a sort of a layer of activity around chat apps would be relatively painless. So I guess those were the three things that I was trying to figure out in terms of a strategy for pilots. So we ended up working on 5 platforms over the preceding few months. BlackBerry Messenger, Wechat, WhatsApp, an app called Mixit, which is very big in South Africa, and an app that we've recently launched a global English news account on called Line, which is very big in Asia. I'll talk through some of these in more detail, but predominantly I want to talk about one of our main pilots, which was around the Indian general elections. The reason we chose this as our first sort of experiment with chat apps was that we wanted to really try and experiment with what appeared to be the 2 biggest sort of global chat apps out there. And WhatsApp was clearly the biggest global chat app in terms of numbers that we'd come across. And WeChat was also growing very quickly. So WeChat is originally a Chinese app. It's got about 300, 400 million users inside China, but it now has about 150 million users globally outside China as well. And one of the countries that they really wanted to try and expand on quite quickly was in India. And so it seemed to make sense that we could try out both of these platforms. They operate in quite different ways, so I'm going to talk you through how they work and what we did. And the idea was that we basically set up one BBC India account on both of those platforms, but there would be dual language, so there'll be content in Hindi and English, so that we could take advantage of the period of the pilot to really try and test the different languages and also the different audiences that consume content in those languages. So first of all, with WeChat, WeChat is quite a sophisticated platform. It already has a sort of a brand platform capability inside the app. So there are lots of brands in China that can set up their own accounts pretty much as you could set up your own brand page on Facebook, for example. Outside China at the moment, it's brands have to go through an application process with Wechat, which is what we did with them. So we set up a BBC India account. And so the screen on the left that you can see is the sort of the daily push alert that we were sending out. Wechat allows you to send out one push alert a day to your subscribers. But you can determine, there's quite a lot of flexibility in terms of what that push alert is, whether it's a piece of content or in this case sort of a bundled news alert where we've got, in this case, 4 news stories. And so as soon as a user clicks on any one of those tabs, you'll get the screen that you see on the right, which is a bit more detail on the story. And then at the bottom you can read more by clicking through, and that will take you through to the full web page with that article on our website. The clever thing about Wechat is that it has a built-in browser inside the app, so whenever users click on links, the browser opens up inside the app, so the user doesn't get kicked out of the app, but actually they can then just start sharing with their friends that page link inside the app, which is pretty smart. The other thing that Wechat has is the capability for you to feed in automated RSS feeds. And so along the bottom here, as you can see, we set up 3 different tabs, 1 in English and 2 in Hindi. And those were just being fed by RSS feeds. And so users, in addition to getting that daily push alert, they could also go into our homepage inside the app and get the latest news stories through those feeds. And then when they click on them, that will again push them through to our website, opening up the browser again inside the app. The other thing that Wechat has is a desktop version, and so they have a very basic but pretty simple to use CMS, so you can be quite collaborative in terms of how many team members can work inside the platform, and also manage the comments, and also gives you some basic analytics as well. So that moves on me on to WhatsApp, which is the sort of complete opposite of Wechat in the sense of there is no CMS, there is no desktop version, and so everything has to happen from your mobile phone handset. And so with that comes with it a lot of difficulties in terms of how you manage the workflow for something like this. And so the way we ended up doing it was that we created an account just in the same way that many of you, may have set up your own WhatsApp account, and then we promoted that mobile number through our existing social media channels, and also on our website as a sort of promotional page within our indexes. And what we asked people to do was to send a message to join or subscribe to the service, and then we would add them onto a broadcast list. So for those of you not too familiar with WhatsApp, there are 2 ways that you can push content out inside the app. One is a WhatsApp group, where you can add, I think, about 150 people to the group. And when you push out content, everyone in the group can see it and respond to it. They all see each other's responses, but they also see each other's contact details as well. And so that would have been a nightmare of epic proportions trying to handle something like that. So that was clearly not something we were going to do. But the alternative is something called a broadcast list. And I guess the best way of describing that is sort of an email BCC list. So again, in this case, you can add up to 250 people to a broadcast list, and then push out an alert or a piece of content to that list. They would receive it as a one-to-one communication from you to them. They could reply back and you would receive that reply, but no one else can see what's going on the list or see any other contacts on that list. Because this was the first time, as far as I could tell, any news organization had done something like this. WhatsApp were as interested as us to figure out, whether this was going to be interesting to its users or not. And so they gave us a little bit of help with the broadcast list in terms of lifting the limit. And so that made it a little bit more manageable in terms of how we could push content out. But one of the big challenges then was the fact that this was, as far as, again, I could tell, the first time an editorial project at the BBC News certainly incorporated all aspects of production, publishing, audience interaction on one blinking mobile phone, which was difficult. So one of the things that are challenging about that is that when someone sends you a subscribe message, you have to go, okay, add him to my contacts address book, and then add them to my broadcast list. And I did that thousands of times in a lonely hotel room over a 6-week period. The other thing is, obviously, if you lose your handset, then your project is over. And I hadn't really paid much attention to that until colleagues started telling me that what happens if you lose your handset, at which point I started to basically live, breathe, and sleep with my handset, and walked around with a security entourage just to make sure I didn't get mugged on the streets. So what did the content look like? So we want to try and test out a lot of different types of content. And so one of the things instantly we realized that proved to be very effective, and it was particularly useful for our World Service language services, many of them who are in radio, the audio worked very effectively, and it tended to be sort of 30 to 45 second clips that worked particularly well. So one example that we tried out was there was a really interesting radio documentary that one of our journalists in the Delhi Bureau did, which is all about the subject of paid media, which in India is a really, really big issue for many voters. And this is the idea that media will give favorable news coverage to organizations or parties in exchange for money. Not something any of us would do, right? But it's very common in India. And we pulled out 3 or 4 really interesting interview clips that Shilpa Kannan had done in that radio documentary, and we sort of created a sort of a little mini series on WhatsApp over the course of a week, where we pushed out clips one at a time over a period of a week, and it proved to be very, very successful. The other audio experiment that we did, which also seemed to be pretty successful, was that we would cut a minute's worth of audio from the daily Hindi news service news report that would go out on in India. Yes, Wolfgang.
Trisha, if I could just ask, how did you measure success within WhatsApp?
So I'll come to this, but one of the big difficulties with WhatsApp is that there are no metrics. And so pretty much all the measures that you have are sort of the anecdotal responses that you get. And you can sort of break down a sort of percentage based on how many responses you get compared to how many people who you know are subscribed to your list on a given day, and then work out whether that percentage is increasing or decreasing over the course of the campaign. And then you sort of get a sort of an idea in terms of this percentage is what would probably be an average sort of response, and this percentage is a particularly good one or a low one. And so that's the sort of the measures that we had. The thing that's also probably quite interesting about WhatsApp is that when you deliver a piece of content, like a video clip or audio clip or an image, it downloads straight onto someone's phone unless they specifically change the setting on their phone, which means that they then have that audio file on their phone to listen to again and again whenever they want to as an MP3 file, or share very easily with their friends. So it was quite a powerful way of delivering that sort of content. And so another type of video that did particularly well was that the BBC have a relatively new team called BBC Trending, which does a lot of sort of features and reports around the stories behind social trends. And quite often their videos tend to be pretty short and sort of punchy. And they seem to do really well on WhatsApp as well. Now, this was something I really wanted to try and experiment, which was the idea of using emoji. Now, how many of you have WhatsApp? Use WhatsApp? How many of you have used a smiley face or a crying face or some sort of emoji during the course of your chat conversation? Pretty much everyone who has WhatsApp, right? And that's almost the purpose of having a chat app, that you can share some of your feelings through emoji. And so I wanted to find out whether there was any space within news to try and experiment with emoji. And so I wanted to see if there was a story that we could test this out on to see what the audience reaction would be. And whilst I was looking at this, one of the things I noticed on my own sort of social media news feeds was a number of my friends and relatives who were getting quite upset and responsive to a story about the EU, which had banned the import of Indian mangoes for a couple of years. And I saw lots of my friends who were very upset at the fact that they weren't going to have any mangoes to eat this summer. I was pretty upset as well. So I thought we might be quite a good one to try and see if we could push that out as a story which was written fairly straight, but at the end just inviting people to send in their emoji reaction. Now, is this classed as news? There was certainly quite a debate in our own newsroom about, is this the sort of thing BBC News should be doing? Does this dumb down stories too much by just having smiley faces at the bottom of it, inviting the audience to respond in that way? But this was the single most engaged post that we did throughout our 6-week pilot on WhatsApp. We had hundreds of responses which were just faces. Angry faces, smiley faces, whatever. Ideally, it would have been great if I could work out how to actually have done an emoji cloud, which I could have posted back to the audience saying this is the predominant emotion or feeling that you've responded to us with. But I genuinely think that there is a lot in here in terms of how we could potentially take advantage of this sort of interaction in terms of getting a better sense of how our audience feels about a story and not just how they think about a story. The other thing that we then did, so up until the election results day, we had limited ourselves to just posting 2 or 3 push alerts a day because we were very aware that when you send out a push alert, it's going to pop up straight away on someone's phone. And so we didn't want to spam people. We decided to change tack for election results day. And we sort of promoted or advertised the fact that we would be doing this from a week ahead of time. And so we told our audience that on election results day, we're going to be providing a live rolling results and analysis service to keep you up to date with how the results are coming through. Now, in India, election results day happened on a Friday during the day, unlike overnight, which often happens in Western elections. So the majority of voters would have been at work, and so probably wouldn't have had access to news channels, and a lot of them would have had very limited data plans, which would have prevented them from constantly checking websites on their phones. And so WhatsApp was a great opportunity for them to be able to be given updates without it costing them too much data, and also being able to carry on with their work mostly. I should add a bit of context that the Indian election this time round was close as I can think of was probably a World Cup cricket final in India. The level of interest across the country was quite phenomenal. I've not noticed that level of interest in a number of Indian elections up until this point. The other thing we also realized was that there was an opportunity to use the status update to better effect. So normally on a status update on chat apps, if you have it, you'll say I'm busy, I'm on the phone, or something else. But WhatsApp allows you to write whatever you like as your status update. And so we decided on the screenshot on the left that we could use it as a rolling sort of counter for the seats as they were coming in. And so that again allowed users to basically glance at our status update inside WhatsApp to get the latest in terms of what the seat count was without having to get. And he had just taken a short 30-second video of drums and celebration and colour at the fact that the party had won. He took it on his phone and sent it to me on WhatsApp. And then I just pushed it out onto our account on WhatsApp as well. And so from the time he took the video to the time I pushed it out onto our account, I think it was about 5 minutes, the difference. So that was just something that was also really interesting to learn, that actually this could be a really useful way of managing content internally amongst our teams on the ground. The other thing we really wanted to experiment a lot with was images. And we went through lots of different iterations, and then about halfway through the project we realized that whenever we post an image, we really need to make sure our brand is sort of burnt into the image. And the reason for that is, unlike with Twitter with a retweet or a share on Facebook, when you share an image inside WhatsApp, the branding that's associated with it doesn't travel with it. So all that goes with it is the image. And so whilst we may have had loads of people discovering our pictures or graphics after being sent to the sent on to them from friends, they wouldn't have known that it had come from the BBC until. So that's why we realised that we needed to make sure that our brand was on those images. The other thing that we experimented with a bit was using illustrations or cartoons. As luck would have it, we had a cartoonist in the Delhi bureau during the course of the election, on election results day, and he'd been brought in to mainly do sort of caricatures of some of the party leaders that we would put up on our website. But we asked him to see if he could do something quite reactive as soon as we knew what the result was. And I guess you could describe this as the BBC's first ever cartoon news alert that was pushed out on any platform. And so, again, the newsrooms of the future, cartoonists might come quite handy. But again, based on responses we had back, people seem to quite like this sort of content that they were receiving on WhatsApp. So the positives and negatives with WhatsApp. By far, it's the biggest global audience base that we have. 600 million active users blows any other chat app out of the water at the moment, although others are catching up. But the big problem with it is that it's very labor intensive. At the moment, WhatsApp doesn't have a CMS that's supported or a desktop version. And so everything has to happen on a mobile phone handset. In terms of other positives, we had very low unsubscribe rates. So once people managed to get subscribed, very few of them blocked our account or asked or requested to be unsubscribed. The feedback was very, very positive, and a lot of the anecdotal evidence we had suggested that we were reaching new users. And I guess one of the ways that we could sort of test that a little bit was just scrolling through the user profile images of our subscribers to give you a sense of who they might be or what their backgrounds might be. And that was quite useful information. In terms of the other negatives, apart from being very labor intensive, the fact that you can only do it on one mobile handset makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to work in a collaborative way, and so it's only usually just one person that can work on it at any one time. The app's not really built for pushing out content to thousands of people at a time at the moment. It's not engineered that way, so it proved to be quite unstable at times. I think part of it was the fact that we were using a relatively low-end smartphone at the time, and so in hindsight we probably would have gone with a smartphone with a much more powerful processor, which would have alleviated the problems a little bit. No analytics, as was mentioned a little earlier, and there's no way either to really promote our account inside WhatsApp. It's a very flat structure in terms of visibility of accounts, and so the only way we could really do any promotion of our service was off-site through our other social media channels and through our website. Wechat, I guess the pros and negatives are pretty much reversed. It has a very slick platform for users. It has an easy-to-learn publishing platform. It gives you basic analytics in terms of the number of people who are subscribing to your account day to day. And also, because it already has a brand platform and we'd set up sort of a more formal partnership with Wechat, they're able to give our account a bit of prominence for Indian users of Wechat through their sort of official accounts tab. And it was completely stable. There are no issues of the app crashing in terms of content that we're publishing. But the negatives, users tended to be much more passive. They tended to be much more just lean-back readers of our content rather than proactively responding to content that we're pushing out. Certainly with WhatsApp, it seemed to be much more of a personal sort of service that users were getting. And I think part of the reason for that is, any message that WhatsApp users normally get is from a friend or someone they know, and then suddenly to get something from BBC News, they sort of grouped a bit of that sort of connection with their friends, and so there was a bit more of a personal connection with our brand as a result. So I just wanted to mention briefly a couple of other pilots that we did. We wanted to try and test out different regions of the world with different types of apps, knowing that different audiences have different tolerances to the types of content they receive. And that's mostly due to the fact that they will have different data plans or different data connectivity. One country we were really, or one continent we were really interested in was Africa. very different to the West in terms of the majority of users have very limited data plans, if any at all. Now, BBM, although BlackBerry is a handset provider, is sort of fallen away. BBM has sort of broken out of BlackBerry handsets and is now available on iOS and Android platforms, and as a result, is doing pretty well and is actually growing. And so it's one of the, if you like, success stories of BlackBerry, if amid all the doom and gloom that you hear. And one of the countries that was particularly strong in terms of BlackBerry users is Nigeria, where particularly the sort of more middle-class mobile phone users have sort of high-end feature phones or low-end smartphones, and a lot of them use BlackBerry Messenger. And BlackBerry Messenger recently had launched a sort of a channels capability inside the app, which many of you may not even know that exists inside it. And so if you look through the tabs in BlackBerry Messenger, there is now a channels tab where various brands now have accounts inside the app. And so we partnered with our BBC Hausa language service, which is a service that offers news content, particularly to northern Nigerians. They had already gone mobile first as a team 6 months prior, and so they had already got used to the idea of creating content, knowing that the majority of their users would be consuming it on mobile phone handsets. And so it seems to be quite a good link. And also, of course, Nigeria having a lot of very big stories taking place at the moment. And so this is just a screenshot of what it looks like. It's a very simple service. It just has usually a paragraph of information about a particular story, and then a link to the mobile side of that, where the story can be conceived in more depth. And this is something that users can then just keep across and get updates on inside the app. Another app we also tried out was for a shorter period of time, just for 2 weeks, in the lead up to the South African elections. And this is an app called Mixit, which is very big in South Africa, and particularly among younger, poorer South Africans. Mixit was a chat app that was built originally for feature phones rather than smartphones. And so it was an opportunity for us to try and see what the appetite could be for editorial content amongst younger, poorer African South Africans. And so this is the opening screen of our election account. It's very simple. The tabs there that you have there, when you click on them, will then take you on to additional text updates and stories relating to those subjects. In addition to that, Mixit users can then also leave comments at the bottom of those stories, similar to Facebook comments. And this was really useful for us because it allowed us to have access to an audience in terms of what they were thinking around the election in a way that we would have probably struggled with. As a brand, BBC News is seen as a bit of an aging brand amongst younger people in South Africa, and so this was a really interesting opportunity for us to be able to engage with them directly. One of the other interactive elements that Mixit offers, and a number of apps offer actually, is the use of polls. And we just ran this poll during the course of that 2-week period, asking Mixit users what matters most to them during this election. And what was interesting about the results of this poll was that 75% of respondents talked about jobs and education as being the key things that mattered to them. And why that was interesting was that the majority of the sort of election coverage amongst most mainstream news organizations at the time was focused much more around the party leadership of the ANC and their past record, and very little about the issues that the younger Mixit users were certainly concerned about. And that actually helped inform our own election coverage, and we did our own news report specifically looking at these two issues as a result of the findings of this. And finally, in terms of experiments we've done up to date, having learnt some of those lessons from those previous pilots, just over a week ago, we launched our first official sort of rolling or permanent BBC News account on a platform called Line. And Line, you may not have heard of too much about. It has 300 million users globally, so it's already more than Twitter in terms of the number of global users. And it's particularly strong in Asia. And so again, from our global news perspective, it's a very interesting audience for us. And The other thing that's interesting about Line is that the majority of its users tend to have higher data plans than the sort of the services of the countries that we targeted previously, which gave us the opportunity to try and use or experiment with rich media content a lot more. And so that included sending out short video clips for a strand that we call BBC Shorts, which is a sort of 15-second explainer of the big story of the day, which I'll show you a bit later on. I'm not sure if you can see it too clearly, but the image on the left at the bottom, users can also give emoji reactions to that story. It seems to be a really effective way of getting instant response and engagement amongst audiences rather than just asking them to type a comment. It seems to be much easier for them to do a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a different type of emoji reaction. And it's certainly something that we want to try and do more of in terms of experimenting with audience engagement. On the right-hand side, this is just how a user's timeline inside Line would look like. As you can see, the content on the top, the BBC News content, would just appear as part of their news feed. The difference being, compared to a Facebook timeline, is that they will be able to view every bit of content that is posted by the accounts they follow. So there's no algorithm that's sort of filtering content into that timeline. And I guess that's one of the points that's very interesting about these sort of chat apps compared to something like Twitter or Facebook, which is that if whenever you post something on Twitter or Facebook, you know that only a tiny fraction of your audience is ever going to actually see that update, either because they won't be on Twitter at the time or because the Facebook algorithm may not actually allow it to actually get it to their news feed. Whereas everything that you post on a chat app will be seen by your audience, pretty much 100% of your audience. So that brings me on to what we've learnt so far. Everything that I've looked at and everything that we've done in terms of our experiments so far, one lesson that is definitely the case, as far as I'm concerned, the chat app push alert is the most potent content delivery system in history. So this is even more potent than your own, push alerts that you may have on your news apps. The reason for that is that you can push actual content, not just text messages, but it can be audio clips, it can be video clips, it can be images, infographics. They all appear as a pop-up instantly on someone's phone. And as I mentioned earlier, they will reach pretty much 100% of your audience, probably within minutes. So it's a really, really powerful delivery mechanism. Obviously, that means we have to be very careful and think quite a lot about what it is that we're pushing out, because, again, the risk is quite high that people will block you very quickly if they feel that they're not getting value for what they've signed up for or subscribed to. Chat apps enable you to be more intimate with your audience, and that's certainly what we've discovered through WhatsApp and some of the other chat apps that we've looked at, and most recently with Line. And I think a lot of that is because of the sort of emoji-driven interaction that comes with our content. And one of the things I realized with WhatsApp is that when people send us messages back saying, "Thanks, that was a really interesting news report that you've just sent to me," sometimes I would just send a thumbs up back to them. And the amount of people that I would see then going on Twitter, having screen grabbed that, saying, "Oh my God, BBC News has just sent me a thumbs up." But that's, to me, again, anecdotally, it suggests that people really felt a much more of a personal interaction with our brand, which I think is really important. The fact is that a lot of these users do tend to be younger people. And so, this sort of really tricky constituency that you're trying to engage with, this proves to be a really, really effective way of doing that. And chat apps can also improve the communication workflows of your own teams. And so, I talked about that one example with the Indian election where our correspondent on the ground was able to send me something that he'd taken on video and sent it to me within a couple of minutes, and I was able to push it back out within a couple of minutes too. But it's also a very practical way that a lot of teams in different parts of the world in particular use as a way of basic communication. I know of several teams across BBC World Service in Africa in particular, and parts of the Middle East and in Asia, who rely on chat app because it's far more reliable than email communications. In terms of getting instant alerts and messages and figuring out logistics and deployments and so on. I was speaking to someone from APTN just yesterday, and she was saying that it's become an essential tool in terms of communicating with their correspondents and teams on the ground in South America in terms of being able to get quick responses. And so it's worth thinking about how that can be an element in terms of your workflow as well. So what sort of content worked pretty well? A couple of things that really stood out. One was images. Images that help reveal something or has some sort of added value to it do particularly well. And we're quite fortunate at the BBC that there's a particular strand that started relatively recently by our online sort of graphics team called Go Figure. And so what they do is every day they will look at a particular story that they think is particularly interesting from a numbers point of view or a data point of view, and they'll then try and create a sort of an image that we can then try and really push to our audiences on social media with a link back to the story in more detail. And this sort of image, or this sort of product does really, really well on chat apps. I also just want to play you a video of another video strand. So I talked a little bit about BBC Shorts earlier. So these are these 15-second video clips that originally we did for our Instagram account. So they're originally called InstaFacts, but we've since rolled them out to a separate sort of self-standing video product called BBC Shorts, which we can then use to plug into lots of different platforms. And just to give you an example of what these videos look like, I'll play you a clip of some of them.
I come here because I want to fight these people. They are coming here to destroy our country. I want to save my brothers and sisters and my families and my people, the Syrian people, the great Syrian people.
So that brings me on to another important learning, which is aspect ratios of pictures and videos actually are quite important on chat apps, and the square definitely rules rather than the sort of the more rectangular sort of aspect ratio. I guess that sort of makes sense if you just think about it in terms of, most people when they're looking at chat apps tend to be holding them, vertically, and so rather than them having to turn it and flip it and then view the video properly, it just makes it much easier to just view it on that sort of aspect. And so we're very careful now of always making sure that we're thinking about square ratios in terms of content that we push out. And then finally, I talked a little bit right at the start about how BlackBerry Messenger became a really important UGC and sort of source of information and content and intelligence. And to me, that's one of the things that has real immediate value to us, and I think quite possibly to a lot of you as well, which is that it becomes really easy for your audience to use chat apps as a way of getting their content to you. WhatsApp in particular, it's remarkable how easy it is for someone to just, within 3 or 4 taps of their phone, to be able to record a bit of audio, send it to you, or just send a picture or video that they have on their own phone gallery and send it to you, and it's far easier than if they were trying to tweet content to you or send it to you via Facebook. And so this is certainly one of the things that in our sort of short-term future, we're really keen within BBC News to really try and take more advantage of this as well. So that's probably everything I wanted to say. So happy to take questions if there are any. Yeah. Would you mind coming up to the mic, if that's okay, just so that the recording can hear your question?
Emmanuel Tui from C-SPAN. Just on that last point about people being able to send you video, how do you deal with volume and working through that volume? To use the analogy, in the post-9/11 world, intelligence agencies dealing with all the intel that's coming in, how do you deal with all the video that's coming at you and make the most of that video?
Yeah, I think it's important that if you're quite focused about what you want to get content coming in on, and so rather than it just being here's our number, send us whatever you like, I think if you focus it much more on a specific story or a specific issue that you want them to contribute to, that will effectively act as a sort of a filter in its own right. And then, with WhatsApp, for example, and a lot of these other apps, it's relatively straightforward to just quickly scroll through what's coming in and decide what you think is important, and then you can just plug in a USB cable from your phone and just drag and drop it onto your computer hard drive. And so that seems to be pretty effective as far as we've tested so far. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dee Dee Strickland, online producer with CharlotteObserver.com. I believe that WhatsApp was bought by Facebook, isn't that correct? So in your conversations and all of your testing, I assume that you talked to the WhatsApp vendors and people that somewhat, do you have any insight as to whether or not they will be planning to build a CMS, or were they sympathetic to sort of the plight that you were seeing there, given Facebook is very interested in news publishers?
Sure.
Wonder if you knew anything there.
So Facebook don't own WhatsApp yet. It's still going through regulators. So that might take another month or two at the earliest, I think. Based on conversations that we've had with WhatsApp, I mean, they had been very clear from the beginning that they have never really been interested in brands or advertising, because that's not their model for the app. Their app was very deliberately designed to be very simple and just to be used as simple one-to-one communication amongst individuals. But having said that, they were very interested and very surprised at how well our Indian election coverage went. And I think they're certainly more open to looking at how they can remove some of the pain points that certainly I experience in terms of whether there are ways that, maybe in the future they will be able to develop the app so it makes it easier to automatically add people to your lists if they add your number to their address book, for example. I haven't heard anything from them to suggest that they are going to build a CMS, but it could be that they're in a bit of a holding pattern until Facebook takes them over, and then they'll have a bit more resourcing in terms of engineering capability. You have to remember, WhatsApp is still just 70 people in one office in San Francisco, even though they have an audience of 600 million people. And so they're quite limited at the moment in terms of how much they can do in terms of engineering and sort of partnerships and so on.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm from the University of British Columbia in Canada. The chat apps that you've used, it's all been very experimental at this point. Can you give us an example of any mistakes that you've made in this process that you've learned from that maybe we should avoid in the future if we're planning on using it?
Sure. It's not so much mistakes. I guess it's just trying to understand what users really value. So, I mean, with WhatsApp, yeah, it can be quite easy to, mistype stuff, or, there's a bit of the app crashes just as you're just about to send, and then you send again, then you suddenly realize it's been sent twice. And so there are those sorts of bugs that occur, and that's just partly because the app's not really designed for what we want to do at this point in time. But I think the real, with WhatsApp, we tried all sorts of things, including posting an entire article just as text, just to see if there was any interest amongst our users in just getting a long scrolled article just with writing. The answer was no, by the way. That was, I guess, one mistake, but it was, we couldn't know that definitively until we'd actually tried that out. And then also we played around with what the right length of post was. And so, yeah, definitely not a whole article, but what about just one line and a link? or what about a paragraph? And so I guess the closest we've come to so far is that what we tend to do on our Facebook pages seems to work pretty well in terms of transferring that length onto WhatsApp as well. As long as it stays on the screen without a user having to scroll down to read the full text, that seems to work pretty well. Links at the moment inside WhatsApp are proving to be very, very difficult to engage users with. Very few people seem to click on links from what we could measure. And I think the big reason for that is that with WhatsApp, it takes the user out of the app and opens up their phone's own browser. It's less of an issue with some of these other apps that I've talked about, because certainly with Line and with Wechat, they have already created their own browsers inside the app that make it easier. So those are sorts of things we've learned so far.
Hi there, Mathilde Piard from NPR. My question is, what's next? You mentioned a lot of, how important it is to kind of frame things as a pilot to get through bureaucracy. So beyond these pilots, are you still using some of these apps in, these countries where you use them originally just around a specific event, the elections? And if you are, how are you convincing people internally about how this aligns with your broader goals? Like you just mentioned the difficulty in actually driving traffic. I'm sure a lot of people in the room work for not nonprofit journalism organizations. So at the end of the day, sometimes branding and engagement doesn't really matter in the end to the bottom line.
Sure. So yeah, I guess I'm now at a point where I'm looking at sort of medium to longer term strategy in terms of what happens with chat apps. And so yeah, we definitely have plans in terms of what we're going to do in terms of rolling out maybe more permanent services or trying out other apps that we haven't tried out so far in different regions of the world. And we're probably going to, there are two types of strategy that seem to be emerging so far. One is using these sorts of apps and this sort of technology in sort of short bursts as almost like pop-up services around big stories. And then the other is the more sort of longer-term continuing sort of service. And again, within that, there are a couple of different branches. One could be just the more broad pan BBC 24-hour service. So I think there's a lot of value in those sorts of services that have value for users as well. And in terms of wider use, these apps are still at a very young sort of life cycle, so it's important to mention that. Some of these apps are better than others at this stage in terms of the CMSs they offer, the metrics and statistics and analytics they offer. But I can certainly say that inside a year, they will be much better than they are now. And so with that will probably come more opportunities in terms of how you can add commercial layering on top of them or add advertising and promotion. But I think for us, it's very much placing a bit of a bet that we think this technology is really important, it's going to evolve even further, and it's here to stay, which is partly why my role was created, to make sure that we're on top of that. And it could be, some of these apps will rise and fall, but it's just being aware that this sort of audience behavior is here to stay. People are just naturally already expecting to just be able to interact completely socially on their mobile phones. And so that's actually beginning to drive our thinking about what sort of editorial content we need to create. So I guess some of you may have had similar experiences where quite often it's about just repackaging content that already exists on our more traditional platforms of online TV or radio, and then just grabbing a bit of that and then pushing it out on chat apps. Whereas we're moving much more now to a point where we're creating sort of self-standing editorial digital products that can then be pushed or selected more carefully into different platforms. So a bit like the BBC Shorts, a bit like the Go Figure strands that I talked about. Okay.
I was wondering if you look at the UK or the Egypt uprising for that matter, I mean, Black Bear messages fell out of the high-end bracket. They were more of a popular, you could afford them.
Yes.
But if you look at smartphones, for example, in third world countries, I'm thinking that the audience you're reaching will still be upper middle class, upper class with a high literacy and so forth. Do you see any way of getting in touch with poorer people? I was thinking that Twitter, one of the reasons for the success of Twitter was that you could use text messages to tweet as well. Do you see what level of society are you able to reach with this?
Well, this is one of the things that really surprised me quite early on when I was doing this research, which is that chat apps already probably have a much broader demographic than Twitter or even Facebook to an extent. And the reason for that is in many poorer parts of the world, people are using things like WhatsApp as a cheap or free alternative to text messaging. And so actually the last screen I just showed you, this was one of our interactive programs called BBC World Have Your Say. And they'd been covering quite extensively the Typhoon Haiyan that had hit the Philippines at the back end of last year. And one of the big challenges they were facing was that a lot of the sort of telephony and internet infrastructure was very shaky and not very easily used by audiences at the time. And so they're finding it very difficult to get much response and reaction from people in the Philippines. And so they set up a WhatsApp account because quite a lot of people in the Philippines have WhatsApp, so it's not a high-end sort of demographic. And they had a big response of people, ordinary people in the Philippines who were just sending them messages, sometimes even little audio clips or pictures or video clips. And that was a very good early indication that actually WhatsApp has quite a broad demographic. And my own experience in India was lots of anecdotal evidence to suggest that a much broader demographic of Indians are using WhatsApp than even Facebook, which we now think is pretty broad in terms of demographics. One example I can remember was a colleague of mine in the Delhi Bureau told me a story about his uncle, who was quite a poor, illiterate farmer in a rural part of India who had to move for work to Mumbai in the city to get a bit more income. But he would set up with his wife so that his wife would every week send him pictures of his cows from WhatsApp so that he could keep an eye on their development. Now, neither of them, the husband or the wife, could read or write, but they knew how to send pictures to each other using WhatsApp. And so the sort of barrier of entry for this sort of technology is much, much lower. If you think about Facebook or Twitter, you still have to go through a registration process. You've got to think of a username, password, and that actually is quite a high barrier for a lot of these people in different parts of the world, whereas these apps eliminate a lot of that process.
So a little bit like Skype, but I mean the same mechanism, but on your phone instead.
Definitely, yeah.
Carl Weiser with the Cincinnati Enquirer. Which of these chat apps do you use here in the U.S., or which would you recommend we use here in the U.S.?
Sure. In the US, it's quite interesting because Facebook Messenger tends to be the dominant way, or even Gtalk still is pretty big. WhatsApp, I think, is the fourth or fifth biggest chat app, or third biggest chat app in the US. And that, although it's growing much faster in other parts of the world, I think it's beginning to take hold in the US as well. And then you have things like Kik Messenger, which is particularly big amongst younger people in the US. And it's something we've looked at, but haven't done anything with yet. But it seems to be growing very, very quickly. And the probably quite smart thing about Kik Messenger is that they've basically built a browser on top of a chat platform. And so there are loads of different sort of plugins that allow you to watch YouTube videos or even news websites inside the app without you having to leave the app. And so that's certainly one to keep an eye on. And then I guess it's not quite the same thing, but you have Snapchat, obviously, as the big app that's growing in prominence amongst that generation.
Chat apps are, how can I say, locally concentrated. I think Wechat in China or WhatsApp in Brazil or in Europe. Do you think that will be more difficult for global players like New York Times or The Guardian using these channels for delivery contents? Otherwise, Facebook or Twitter?
Sure. I think there's a real opportunity to reach that next level of audience using these platforms. We're all very sophisticated in how we use the likes of Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, and we're all pretty much fighting for that same sort of audience. But there are many people in large parts of Asia, in the Middle East even, in Africa, whose first social interaction on mobile phones or on the internet is with these apps. So even beyond Twitter or Facebook quite often. And so for a global news organization like us, that's something that we're very interested in terms of how can we reach new people. And so one of the things we noticed with our most recent launch online, which is very big in parts of Southeast Asia and parts of Asia and a little bit of Europe, was that the vast majority of those users, we can tell, are young Asian people, because you can look at their profile images when they like stuff. And I'm pretty sure that almost all of them have never consumed BBC News content in any other form before. And so this is the opportunity where I think we can really expand our audiences. The other thing to bear in mind is that chat apps technology is quite interesting, whereas normally technology takes hold in the US and then begins to filter through in terms of user behavior in the other parts of the world. Chat apps, I think, is the opposite, where they really are very sophisticated and they tend to be used much more by people in the Far East and Asia, Southeast Asia. And so if you look at Wechat and Line, there's KakaoTalk and one or two others as well. They're actually very sophisticated in what they do. So as well as just chat platforms, and yeah, they can, people can share content very easily in terms of pictures, videos, audio, and so on. But they already have, commercial platforms on top. In China, you can buy stuff through Wechat. There's a big gaming platform inside Wechat that's also developed. And so there's a lot of that functionality, which is already quite sort of second nature to a lot of users in Asia, that I don't think that behavior is quite migrated to the West yet, but I think it's only a matter of time.
Hi, it's Elizabeth again.
Hi.
I was wondering, you were talking about how a lot of the people in some parts of the world who use the chat apps, they're from some very impoverished communities. So do you know if your news through chat apps is supplementing content that they've had before through a different medium, or replacing it, or is this sometimes the first news that they've been able to read on a regular basis?
Yeah. Certainly inside those platforms, most of the evidence seems to suggest it's the first time they've been consumed news content inside those platforms, just because news organizations are still very new to these platforms and very few ventured into them. In terms of whether they've picked up this news in other places, to be honest, it's just really difficult to tell, just because those metrics don't really exist. Anecdotally, I think the big advantage we have as a brand, we're seen as being a brand that can be trusted and is respected in a lot of the areas of the world that we're trying to target. And so I think that's the sort of one value that we offer, which is that people often are very suspicious of their local media or what news they get from other sources. And so for them, this is a brand that they can trust, and the content that they get is something that they can trust. So I suggest that that's probably more important to them than whether they've heard it elsewhere or not. This is probably the last question we'll have, but yes, go ahead. No, you can go, please.
Thanks. I'm Megan Crane from AFP in Washington. And I was curious, you were talking about the Philippines, for example, that they opened an account in order to interact with people on the ground. So that was a unique account for that purpose?
Yeah, and actually that program just kept that number going, and it's just become a general audience
and then
outreach
is that
number.
sort of how you would see, like I was thinking from the push alerts, for example, to avoid spamming people.
Yes.
Would you suggest creating different accounts, like say for, different sports results, Premier League or whatever, because we do lots of different things, obviously.
It's certainly possible. I think it all just comes in. It just comes down to how easily you're able to resource it, and how challenging that is. I mean, one example in the UK is a local newspaper called the Oxford Mail have set up a WhatsApp, 2 or 3 different WhatsApp accounts. They've created one WhatsApp account, but they've offered different news services through that service. So users can say, I want to just receive news, or just want to receive sports news, or both. And then when they send subscribe, they'll say subscribe news, or subscribe sport, or subscribe both. And then the person that's managing that account will then drop them into the relevant list.
That's managed by hand?
That's managed by hand. So at the moment it's a challenge, but they've managed to do it. And I guess because it's, again, one of the advantages, that because they're a relatively small newspaper, it's relatively straightforward for them to manage a community, because it's going to be relatively low numbers compared to a national level account potentially.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that's all, folks. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful.